And now, aviation weather around Alaska.
Bering Sea storminess pushing IFR here into the southwest coast and eastward across Bristol Bay and past Kodiak Island, northward into the Kuskokwim Valley, and some IFR developing or persisting along the eastern Kenai Peninsula on up into northern Prince William Sound. Another area of IFR growing here overnight tonight and tomorrow. Brooks Range to the eastern Arctic coast spilling down into the Koyukuk Valley to just north of the Yukon River. Central interior to the east here, VFR, Yakutat on down the southeast coast stays VFR. That holds for the Panhandle through Saturday afternoon. Marginal VFR and possible IFR slip on into Yakutat and persist along the North Gulf Coast. Band of IFR here along the eastern slopes of the western Alaska Range. IFR kind of retreating back toward the Brooks Range there over the up here to the north and expanding westward along the Arctic coast there. And an area of IFR holding here, Dillingham, Togiak into the Auckland Mountains and the eastern Bering Sea area, and a little bit there for the Yukon Delta coastline. Otherwise marginal for the Aleutians. And then for Sunday morning, IFR here, Bristol Bay, mostly along and off the coast, but inland for the Alaska Peninsula and Aleutian Range. Still a band IFR for the western Alaska Range on the eastern slopes. IFR for the north slope to the Arctic coast. Some marginal VFR down into the northern valley south of the Brooks Range. But here along the Yukon Kuskokwim River areas on up into the 40 Mile country, then down into the Copper River Basin, mostly VFR for Sunday morning, and marginal VFR with still some VFR over the Panhandle, but definitely conditions a little lower than they have been, and that continues all marginal VFR for the southeast coast on Sunday afternoon with some areas of IFR over toward the eastern border, and Yakutat has some IFR showing up there, marginal for Cordova into Prince William Sound. And the interior looking pretty good, VFR all the way up to the northwest coast, IFR holding there over the north slope out to possibly Kaktovik. VFR here, Yukon Kuskokwim Delta, Seward Peninsula, all of the Bering Sea, and the Aleutians with more IFR now sliding eastward in toward Kiska Island to about Shimia. And for passes, Anatuvik and Adigan tomorrow, both will be IFR and snow. Lake Clark and Merrill, IFR on the eastern approaches, otherwise marginal VFR out to the west. And for Rainy, IFR in the eastern entrance, otherwise marginal. And windy, marginal VFR at times, especially south. And Isabel, marginal VFR. Mentasta, call it VFR there. Tanita, marginal VFR. And expect IFR for Portage on either approach. And Chilkoot and White, another day of VFR. Freezing levels here, 2,000 to 4,000 feet here over the central interior with the warmest air aloft over northwest territories of Canada. 8,000 feet there with upper level ridging. And about 8,000 feet also over the southern southeast coast, but the cooler air kind of sliding slowly eastward. And for icing, quite an area of moderate rime icing here, or mixed from the eastern Arctic coast all the way down along the Yukon Delta coastline, and another area of possible heavier icing here, Cook Inlet into the Kuskokwim Valley, as well as the North Gulf Coast there from Prince William Sound over to Yakutat. And icing threats on the increase over the northern Panhandle, but staying icing free down to the south. And looking at the jet stream, strongest flow at 33,000 feet south of the Aleutians, westerlies 110 to 130 knots. Otherwise, a weaker branch of that kind of breaks off here, looking at southerly winds at about 65 knots there from Yakutat, mostly along and east of the Canadian border. And for the 9,000 foot winds, south-southeast, 40 knots right into Turnagain Arm and the Chugach Mountain areas here, northern Kenai Peninsula, and 50-knot winds blowing across Yakutat on up into Old Crow there. Otherwise, out west, 40 knots coming around this low, tracking into Bristol Bay. So northerlies 35 to 40 knots there across the Pribilofs down into the eastern Aleutians. and northeast 40 knots for the western Arctic coast. At 3,000 feet, northeast winds here for the Arctic coast across the western North Slope, 30 to 35 knots, increasing there around Cape Lisburne and Point Hope, up to 50 knots there. And then northerlies 35 to 40 knots here coming across the Pribilofs, and then closer to 50 knots blowing across the Fox Islands there, with strongest winds just south of Kodiak Island, and a narrow band of 35 knot winds here along the North Gulf Coast into Prince William Sound. And for turbulence, light to isolated moderate turbulence possible. Northern Kenai Peninsula, turning an arm up in toward the Matanuska Valley. Otherwise, considerable moderate turbulence, eastern Arctic coast, central western Brooks Range out to the western Arctic coast, or northwest coast, down through the Bering Strait, St. Lawrence Island, and also from Atka Island in toward False Pass in the far western Alaska Peninsula.